Today's topic and focus will be on nuclear power, and that's not a new issue across the continent. As my colleague Yousef will share, there are a lot of countries that are progressing through the nuclear milestones. But today's discussion will be in three parts. First, I'll speak to you about establishing effective legal and regulatory frameworks now. Second, Yousef will give a survey of where certain projects and development stand on commercial nuclear across the continent. And last, my partner, George Borovas, will give a presentation on developing new nuclear projects and the lessons learned from doing projects in Africa. So what are the three phases? Phase one, assessing the considerations before the decision to launch a nuclear power program. This ends with the country being ready to make a knowledgeable commitment to a nuclear power program. In other words, this is the early assessment step. Should the country develop nuclear power? Can it deliver a nuclear power program? But at the end of this phase, the country should be able to make a knowledgeable, well-informed commitment to a program. Phase two, all the preparatory work for contracting and construction of a nuclear power plant after this policy, the prior policy decision has been made. The end of this phase is where the country is ready to go into negotiations or issue a bid document for its first commercial nuclear power plant. Third phase, activities to implement the first nuclear power plant. That actually means the project's been procured, delivery of construction, a company gets licensed to operate the plant, operators are staffed and trained, the organization is structured, and at the end of this third phase, the company who's been instructed to operate the plant is ready to flip the switch, bring the reactor to criticality, and operate the first nuclear power plant. This is better demonstrated in sort of a diagram. Take a second to look at this. Laser pointer. Again, during phase one, the analysis. Should we, could we, can we deliver nuclear power? At the end, the decision's made. Next, almost as if preparing for an RFP, all the work that goes into issuing the RFP, but also all of the other infrastructure that surrounds a commercial nuclear program. At the end, bids go out into phase three. You hire a contractor, you engage an organization to deliver your nuclear plant. Now you start constructing. At the end, you're ready for commissioning.
So I thought I would start off with a graphic, which some of you may have recently come across on various online forums and platforms. Picking up from Jason's presentation on the phases and milestones, this graphic represents where various countries in Africa are currently in respect of the race to nuclear energy. As you can see, the majority of the countries are still at the very early stages within phase one, and therefore are still analyzing the issues involved in introducing nuclear power to get a comprehensive understanding of the commitments involved before they go ahead to proceed with an informed decision as to proceed with a nuclear power program. You'll see that South Africa is the clear winner of the race, being the only African country with an operating commercial nuclear reactor. And then just highlighting that Egypt is second within phase two, and then Ghana and Nigeria, and then the huddle around the early stages of phase one, which maybe visually may look disappointing, but in reality, it still makes sense given how much research and development is taken and time into before you can actually go ahead to proceed with deciding to go with nuclear energy programs. I will come on to providing brief details about the status of nuclear programs in some of those countries in my next slide. So this classification by the World Nuclear Association puts each country into a category based on the status of nuclear power program. If you just want to take a moment to go through the categories, you'll see that, as mentioned, South Africa is the only country with reactor in operation, and that at this current stage, there are no reactors currently being constructed. However, Egypt has signed a contract and does have a legal and regulatory infrastructure in place. And then we'll see that gap that is presented in essentially not having many countries in phase 2. So that, given that earlier graphic that I showed you, would sort of make sense. And then coming on to the developing plans, more and more countries are hitting that level. And, you know, officially not a policy option has been given by Rwanda and Tanzania and Zambia, for example. So some may have considered it and they said, no, it's officially not a policy for us to proceed with nuclear, which is fair enough. You know, every country will have its own parameters to consider.
First of all, on the objectives of procurement, this is a very important point to make, this graph. If you take a look, you have in the middle the nuclear power project, and that project has a number of stakeholders, right? You have the owner, the sponsor, government, whatever it is. You have the vendor who's going to be providing the nuclear power plant. You have the suppliers that are going to be providing equipment, services, and the rest as sub-suppliers to the vendor. Then you also have the public and their interest in nuclear, their understanding of nuclear, in some cases, their fear of nuclear. Then you have the government, and it's like, why is a government doing this? And we had a very good question during Jason's presentation about this issue, right? Because, like, what is the motivation? Why does government want to do this? Do they want jobs? Do they want electricity? Do they want to develop a industry? There's a number of considerations there. And then you have to think about, okay, what are the investors that are going to invest in this? What do they want out of this? What are the lenders, banks that might be giving you debt for this project, what they might be concerned about? So each one of these stakeholders has their own interest in their own view about the project. And the key thing in order to make this into a success is to be able to align these interests so they can all have some commonality within the project. You know, if they each of them stay in their own bubble about, you know, what's of interest to them, then you can never really have a successful project. You need to kind of bring them all together in terms of the project so they all have something to gain from the project. It all makes sense for them. You know, you cannot have a project where the public is against it. In the end of the day, no matter what, even if you have, you know, a country that says that, you know, we're going to go ahead and, you know, we're just going to decide to do this. We don't care what our public wants. We're just going to go ahead with this project. It's ultimately is going to fail because the public has to be aligned and supportive of the nuclear project. If you go in there and you just say, well, we don't care, you know, what the investors are going to do. Are they going to make money? Are they going to make, return on their investment? Again, that's going to fail. Are you going to care about what the vendor is going to be? They need to be successful as well. So again, taking into account all of these considerations is important for the ultimate success of the nuclear project. So nuclear liability is a very, very difficult subject. Just to give you a very high level about what we're talking about here is the issue of third-party nuclear liability. So there's an accident, people get injured, businesses get destroyed, whatever happens, and you know, there could a lot of claims. So if you look at Fukushima, that happened here in Japan, there was the accident in 2011, and there is thousands upon thousands of claims of injury. Thankfully, there were no deaths involved with the Fukushima accident, but you know, people had to be evacuated out of their neighborhoods, out of their houses, of their villages, and those people need compensation for lost revenue, for loss of their house, or for all the things that they lost. the issues about cleaning up certain areas, all these things have to be addressed in a certain way. Because the potential is massive, right? We're talking about multiple $billion potential lawsuits here. There has been established a whole regime about nuclear liability, which is a regime based on standards about practices and international conventions on how it works and how it should work. So basically what happens in nuclear liability is that you have to have one party that's responsible. That's so-called the channeling of liability. So the channeling of liability into the operator, whoever operates the plant. And basically what this principle says is that it does not matter why the accident happened. If there was a defective product, then it still does not matter. You, under the law, you, the operator, are still responsible to pay compensation for the accident, which is very useful, of course, for the providers of equipment, right? Because they can say, okay, I know that legally under the law, I'm not going to be responsible for anything. So I'm not too worried about, about this issue. Now, it gets very complicated, and we certainly don't have the time to discuss this. This is a whole training session just on nuclear liability and the nuances. But basically, there is the issue of like, okay, there is a channeling of the liability. The law and the conventions require to have some kind of minimum coverage, $1 billion, $1.5 billion, or 300 million SDRs, the currency, the standard currency that used in some of these conventions. But the question that always occurs is what happens when that money runs out, when the insurance runs out. And this is where it becomes difficult and complex, and governments have to step in. But this is an issue that I've seen projects actually fall apart because there could be no understanding about the issue about nuclear liability. And it's one of the things that always ends up being solved probably last minute because people kind of give up on some position that they had. Very, very difficult subject. And the point, of course, about it is that you have, no matter how much you design around this, the law can be very nicely done. You always have gaps in nuclear liability. And you have, for instance, neighboring countries. You might have a regime under your law that says what happens in your own country, but radiation does not understand borders. So you might have injury in another country. You might have injury in the high seas. What happens there? So there's all kinds of issues you have to consider. And this is a big fight always between the owners and the vendors on what kind of regime you're going to have. Are they going to get an indemnity? What does that indemnity mean? So something to keep in mind, nuclear liability is a tough subject.